The forbidden Spellbook. The wind howled against the towering walls of the palace of Vardain, carrying with it the scent of the river's silvered waters and the distant perfume of autumn leaves. The great hall, once vibrant with the voices of nobles and courtiers, lay in silence as Prince Kael strode past its arching colonnades. Evening had descended, and with it came the hush of the royal chambers, where torches flickered and cast trembling shadows upon the high stone walls. The young prince, his mind restless with the weight of unspoken thoughts, sought solace in the one place that had always given him peace: the royal archives. He descended the narrow spiral staircase, his boots clicking softly against the worn steps as the scent of parchment and aged ink grew stronger. The great library stretched before him, its towering shelves brimming with knowledge carved in brittle vellum and bound in leather cracked with time. These halls held the chronicles of Vardain's kings, the forgotten wars, the treaties written in trembling hands, and the whispers of those who had sought power beyond their reach. Kael had explored these corridors many times, poring over the records of his ancestors. Yet on this night, something guided him further, beyond the familiar. A draught curled through the aisles, unsettling the dust of long-forgotten tomes. Then, as if answering an unspoken call, his gaze landed upon a section he had never noticed before. A corridor where the candlelight seemed dimmer, where the air itself grew thick with a presence unseen. The stone archway that framed this passage was different from the others, its carvings older, deeper, worn by time, yet still pulsing with an eerie energy. The sigils etched into its surface bore markings unfamiliar to him, their shapes twisting in the dim glow. A whisper, not a voice, but something deeper. Something felt, brushed against his thoughts. Curiosity, that ever-dangerous flaw, pulled him forward. He stepped into the passage, his breath steady but his heart quickening. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the very fabric of the world was pressing inward. At the end of the corridor stood a door unlike any other in the castle. It was not adorned with gold, nor carved with the symbols of his ancestors. Instead, it was dark, almost blackened, its wood ancient and rough, bound by iron clasps that glowed faintly in the dim light. Kael reached out, fingers tracing the cold surface, and as he did, a shiver ran up his spine. The door yielded to his touch with a reluctant groan, swinging open to reveal a chamber untouched by time. The air within was thick, stagnant, and heavy with secrets unsaid. In the center of the room, beneath a single shaft of pale moonlight, stood a pedestal of black stone, and upon it rested a book unlike any he had ever seen. The tome was bound in a leather so dark it seemed to drink the light around it, its surface veined like the skin of something once living. The clasps that held it shut bore the same sigils as the archway, symbols that pulsed as though they recognized him, as though they had waited. His breath came shallow as he stepped closer. drawn by something beyond reason, beyond caution. A single word trembled in the back of his mind. Red. His hands hovered above the cover, the very air around it vibrating with unseen power. He had read of such things in the oldest texts. Artifacts sealed away by those who knew their danger, forgotten so that their power would never again be unleashed. But those were only stories, tales meant to warn, to keep the young from seeking knowledge not meant for mortal hands. And yet, this was real. The book was here, and it was calling him. With a final breath, he undid the clasps. A rush of wind tore through the chamber, though there were no windows, no open doors. The torches flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows against the stone. The pages flipped open of their own accord, ink shifting across the parchment like flowing water, twisting, forming words he had never seen before, yet somehow understood. His lips parted, his voice an echo of something ancient, something forgotten. Anaris Velthar, Narukath, Othrael. The air thickened. The walls trembled. A deep sound, like the groaning of the earth itself, reverberated through the chamber. The flickering light bent and stretched unnaturally, warping the space around him. Then, in the depths of the castle, a sound unlike any other rang out. A sound that did not belong in the world of the living. It was not a roar, not a cry, but something deeper, something vast and unshaped, like the voice of time itself unspooling. Kyle staggered back, the book snapping shut of its own accord. His breath came fast, his hands trembling, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound before. It was a silence so thick, so absolute, that it pressed against his skull like an unseen weight. Then, from the darkness beyond the chamber, something woke. The stone beneath his feet vibrated, a slow tremor that pulsed in time with the wild beating of his heart. He turned, a shadow moving in the farthest corner of the room where no light touched. It was not a man, nor beast, nor anything he could name, but it was watching him. He could feel its gaze, cold as the void between the stars. A whisper crawled through the room, though no lips spoke it. A voice, thin and stretched, breathed through the chamber. You have spoken the words, child of Adan, and now the world will remember. The torches died. Darkness swallowed the chamber, and far above, beyond the palace walls, the sky itself began to change. The night never ended. Kyle emerged from the chamber, as if waking from a dream, yet the world he stepped into was no longer the same. The castle corridors stretched unnaturally, the familiar stone archways now casting shadows that reached too far, flickering and shifting like living things. The air was thick, pressing against his skin with an unseen weight, and though his torch still burned, its flame was weaker, as if reluctant to fight against the darkness that had taken root. His heart pounded as he ascended the spiral staircase, but when he reached the grand hall, his breath caught in his throat. The banners of his ancestors, which had hung for centuries, were gone. Not tattered, not fallen, but simply absent, as though they had never been. The great chandeliers above, which once burned with golden light, flickered with an eerie dimness, their glow struggling to exist. The world itself felt stretched thin, as if something had begun to unravel the very fabric of reality. He ran. His boots echoed against the stone. The sound distorted, distant, as if coming from some place that no longer belonged to him. The palace guards were there, standing at their posts, but their eyes were vacant, their expressions frozen. They did not stir as he passed. Panic surged through him. He burst into the throne room, his voice hoarse as he called for his father. King Aldemar sat upon his throne, but his face was pale, his hands gripping the armrests with quiet tension. His gaze lifted, heavy with knowing, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice as solemn as the grave, he spoke. "What have you done?" The question was a whisper, yet it carried through the vast hall, pressing against Kyle's very bones. He opened his mouth to explain, to confess, but before he could utter a word, the castle trembled. A low, deep sound echoed from beneath them. Not an earthquake, not a storm, but something far worse. It was a sound of breaking, of unmaking, as if the world itself was cracking open. Then from the depths of the palace it came. A fissure split through the marble floor, its jagged edges glowing with an eerie pulsing light. The torches flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows as something began to rise. They were not creatures, not beasts, not anything that should have existed in the realm of the living. They had no faces, no true forms, only shifting outlines, as if they had been pulled from a world forgotten. Their bodies flickered, their edges dissolving like mist, yet reforming, pulsing, shifting in shapes too broken to understand. They moved in silence, and yet Kyle felt their presence pressing against his mind, whispering without words, demanding something he did not understand. Aldemar rose from his throne, his voice heavy with both fear and fury. The unmade. Kyle did not understand the name, but the way his father spoke, it sent ice through his veins. He took a step back as the figures moved forward, gliding across the shattered floor, their forms shifting in and out of existence. The guards did not react, standing frozen, their eyes empty, as though they too had been touched by whatever force had been unleashed. Then, the first of the unmade reached the nearest pillar, and Kale watched in horror as the stone itself began to dissolve, crumbling into nothingness. Not into dust, not into ruin, but into a void, a space where nothing remained. Reality itself was breaking. Aldemar turned to him, his expression grim. "You have spoken the words of Astrakhan." His voice was tight, controlled, but Kale could see the weight behind it. The spell of unmaking has been read. Kale's stomach twisted. He had not meant for this, had not known what the words would do. His voice was weak when he spoke. "I can fix it." His father's gaze darkened. "No one can." The throne room trembled again. The unmade did not stop. They moved forward, silent, patient, inevitable. The very tapestries of Vardain's history, depictions of great kings, of wars won, of peace forged, began to fade from existence. The walls themselves seemed to blur, as if they had never been built. Kael's breath was shallow, his pulse hammering. This was not just a curse. This was not just darkness creeping into the kingdom. This was something worse. This was erasure. He turned, fleeing from the throne room, even as his father called after him. He ran through the palace halls, past servants who did not move, past doorways that flickered between existing and vanishing entirely. Every corridor, every step felt wrong, as if he were walking through something half-formed, something unraveling. By the time he reached the courtyard, the city beyond had already begun to change. The great towers of Vardain, the bustling markets, the glowing lanterns of the evening streets. Pieces of them had begun to fade, entire buildings dissolving into the encroaching void. The sky above, once rich with stars, was now wrong. The stars were shifting, dimming, their constellations unfamiliar. He turned in desperation as Sardain, his oldest friend and most trusted knight, ran toward him, his sword drawn though against what? Kael did not know. The knight's expression was grim, his voice sharp. "What is happening?" Kael could not answer. Behind them, another fracture split through the earth, and from its depths, more unmade began to rise. He did not know what he had unleashed. He did not know how to stop it. But there was only one place left where answers could be found. The Oracle of Elaris. The name struck his mind like lightning. The knowledge coming from someplace deep within him, as if it had been waiting. He turned to Dain, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We have to leave. Now." Dain did not question him. He did not ask why or how. He simply nodded, his grip tightening on his sword as the world behind them continued to crumble. And as they fled into the night, Kael cast one last glance at the palace, at the home he had known all his life. The walls, the banners, the grand towers that had stood for centuries. Piece by piece, they were vanishing into nothingness. The kingdom was unraveling, and it was all his fault. The road from Vardana was not as they had left it. Kael and Dain rode hard through the night, their horses pounding against earth that no longer felt solid. The very air trembled, heavy with something unseen, something unraveling at the edges. The trees that lined the ancient roads of the kingdom stood tall, yet their leaves seemed faded, their outlines blurred, as if they had been half forgotten by the world itself. A silence hung over the land, not the quiet of midnight, nor the peace before dawn, but something deeper, something unnatural. The rustling of the wind through the fields had ceased. The birds did not call. Even the rivers, which had sung through the valleys of Vardan for generations, now flowed without a sound, their waters dull and still. Kael tightened his grip on the reins, his knuckles white. His mind raced, struggling to grasp what was happening. how far the damage had spread. He had seen the palace dissolve before his eyes, the unmade rising from its depths, but he had not dared to believe the curse had reached beyond those walls. Yet as he rode, the truth became undeniable. This was not a plague that could be contained. It was not an enemy that could be fought with steel. The spell had taken hold of the kingdom itself, and like rot spreading through the roots of a great tree, it was unmaking the world piece by piece. Dain rode beside him, his eyes sharp beneath his dark helm. He had been silent for much of the journey, but Kyle could feel the weight of his unspoken questions. Finally, the knight spoke, his voice low and steady. "Tell me the truth, Kyle. What did you do?" The words cut deeper than any blade. Kyle hesitated, his mouth dry, but there was no point in hiding it now. He exhaled, his breath unsteady. "There was a book," he said, the words tasting like iron on his tongue. "A book hidden beneath the castle. I read from it." Dain's grip tightened on his reins. "And the spell?" Keikul swallowed hard. "I didn't know what it was. The words, they felt like they were already inside me, waiting to be spoken. And when I said them..." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The world started to fall apart. Dain did not speak at first. His expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed ahead. But Kyle could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened beneath his armor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet heavy. "The king said you read the words of Azrakhan." Kyle nodded, though the name itself still sent a chill through him. "Yes." Dain's silence stretched before he finally muttered, "Then the stories were true." Kyle turned sharply toward him. "What stories?" Dain's eyes did not leave the road. "The old legends. My father used to speak of them when I was a child, though I always thought them no more than tales to frighten disobedient sons." He inhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "They say Azrakhan was the first sorcerer, the one who discovered magic before the gods placed their laws upon the world. His power was limitless, but his knowledge was a curse. He created spells no man should wield, words that could twist time, unmake flesh, unravel the fabric of existence itself." Kale felt his stomach tighten. "And the spell of unmaking?" Dain's gaze darkened. It was said to be the last spell Azrakhan ever wrote. A magic so terrible that when he spoke it, he erased not just his enemies, but entire histories, entire cities, entire lives. No one knows what became of him afterward. Only that the spellbook was hidden, locked away so that no man would ever read it again. Kale's breath came shallow. His fingers curled around the reins, his pulse pounding. He had not simply awakened a forgotten magic. He had spoken words meant never to be uttered again. Words that had already wiped entire civilizations from the face of the world. And now, that same power was unraveling Vardain. A sudden gust of wind tore through the trees, and Kale's horse reared, its eyes wide with fear. Dain steadied his own mount, his hand on the hilt of his sword, but no enemy stood before them, only emptiness. Cale's blood turned to ice. The road ahead, which had stretched toward the distant hills of Elaris, was gone. Not simply overgrown, not destroyed. Gone. The land itself had vanished, replaced by an abyss of nothingness, a void where the world had once been. The earth ended abruptly, jagged as though it had been torn away by unseen hands. And beyond it, stretching as far as the eye could see, was only darkness. Dain swore under his breath. It's spreading faster than we thought. Cale stared into the abyss, his chest tight. He had done this. With a single spell, he had condemned his kingdom to oblivion. He had read words that should never have been spoken, and now the world was paying the price. His hands trembled as he turned his horse sharply. We can't stop here. We have to find the oracle. Dain hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Without another word, they rode along the new edge of existence, following the last fragments of the road toward the distant mountains. They did not speak of what they had seen. There was nothing left to say. The curse was consuming the kingdom. The world itself was vanishing, and time was running out. The road to Elaris was treacherous, though no longer in the way Cale had once known it. The kingdom he had grown up in, the rivers, the hills, the villages that had stood for generations, was falling apart. The further they rode, the more the world warped around them, as though reality itself was struggling to hold its shape. They passed through lands where time had unraveled. In some places, fields of wheat stood frozen in mid-motion, their stalks swaying though there was no wind. In others, the earth itself seemed misplaced. Half-formed roads leading into nothingness. Bridges stretched across rivers that no longer existed. Dain rode beside him in grim silence, his sword always within reach. He had stopped asking questions. There were no more explanations that could be given, no reassurances that could be made. They were alone in a kingdom that was vanishing, and ahead of them, in the distant mountains, lay their only hope. Elaris. It was an ancient place, older than Vardain itself. Legends spoke of it as a city untouched by time, built upon the ruins of civilizations long forgotten. It was said that in its heart stood the oracle, a being neither mortal nor divine, the last keeper of knowledge from a world that no longer existed. If anyone could undo what had been done, it was her. Yet, as they approached the base of the mountain, an unnatural stillness settled over the land. The very air felt heavier, thick with the weight of something unseen. The path before them wound sharply through jagged cliffs, the stones slick with mist that had not been there moments before. Cale pulled his horse to a stop. We go on foot from here. Dain nodded, dismounting without protest. They left their horses behind and pressed forward into the mist, their boots crunching against loose gravel. The climb was steep, the path twisting like the coils of a serpent, but Cale felt something guiding him. A pull. Not physical, but deeper. as though something unseen was waiting for him at the peak. With every step, the mist thickened. Shapes moved within it, shadows that did not belong to them. Cale could hear whispers, voices too faint to understand, but their meaning was clear. They were being watched. Then, without warning, the path ended. Before them stood an archway, carved from stone so old it was cracked with time. Beyond it stretched an expanse unlike anything Cale had ever seen. It was not a temple, nor a city, but a void, a space between worlds, where the sky hung motionless and the ground pulsed like a living thing. And in its center stood the oracle. She was not as he had imagined. Not an old woman shrouded in robes, nor a deity wreathed in light, but something in between. Her form flickered, shifting between flesh and mist, her features neither young nor old, her eyes endless pools of knowledge and sorrow. "You have come," she said, her voice like the echo of something ancient. The child who spoke the words. Cale stepped forward, his throat dry. "The world is unraveling," he said, though he knew she already understood. "I need to undo what I've done." The oracle studied him for a long moment. "Undo?" she repeated softly. "You seek to reverse the unmaking." He nodded, though the way she spoke sent a chill through him. The oracle exhaled slowly, closing her eyes as if listening to something far beyond his understanding. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with sorrow. "The spell of unmaking is not like other magics. It does not destroy, it erases." Her gaze met his, and Cale felt the weight of what he had done settle deeper into his bones. What has been unmade does not return, for it no longer exists. The words struck him like a blow. His chest tightened, his mind racing. "There must be a way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said it yourself. The spell erases. But if something is erased, does that mean it is gone forever?" The oracle's expression did not change, but something in the air around them shifted. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "There is only one path," she said. "The trial of the forgotten ones." Cale's breath caught. He had seen those words before, written in the crumbling texts of the royal library, whispers of a place beyond time, where those lost to the void still lingered. A place where what had been erased could speak again. He did not hesitate. "Tell me what I must do." The oracle's form flickered, her expression unreadable. "The trial is not a test of strength, nor of wisdom. It is a sacrifice." A cold dread settled over him. "What kind of sacrifice?" The oracle took a step closer. "To enter the realm of the forgotten ones, you must give something in return." Her voice was softer now, yet each word cut like a blade. "A memory, a truth, or your very name." Cale felt Dine stiffen beside him, but he did not look away. He already knew the choice he would make. The oracle studied him for a long moment before she finally spoke. "The rift lies beyond the mountain. When you are ready, step forward, and the world will decide what it will take from you." Kale swallowed hard, but his resolve did not waver. He had spoken the words of Azrakhan. He had unmade his kingdom. And now he would face the Forgotten Ones. The wind howled as Kale and Dain stood at the edge of the rift, where the world ended and something else began. The ground beneath them was no longer solid stone, but a fractured boundary, shifting like the surface of a still lake. Beyond it, there was no sky, no horizon, only an abyss that pulsed with a faint, unsettling glow, neither light nor shadow, but something between. The oracle's words still echoed in Kale's mind. A memory, a truth, or your very name. He knew the cost before he even stepped forward, yet the weight of the choice pressed heavily upon him. Dain, standing beside him, tightened his grip on his sword. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice steady but tense. Kale exhaled, his breath curling like mist in the unnatural air. "There's no other way." The knight hesitated, then nodded, though his unease was clear. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't forget who you are." Kale forced a small, grim smile. "I'll try." And then, without another word, he stepped forward. The world shuddered. The rift swallowed him whole. Kale did not fall. He did not float. He simply was. For a moment, if time even existed here, he felt weightless, surrounded by nothingness that pulsed like a great sleeping heart. Then, slowly, shapes began to take form around him. Ruins. Broken archways stretching into a sky that was not a sky. Towering pillars, half-formed and crumbling, floating in an expanse that twisted like a shattered reflection. Shadows moved between them. Not the unmade, but something else, something older. Figures without substance, neither living nor dead, their forms flickering between memory and mist. The Forgotten Ones. They did not speak, yet Kale could feel their presence pressing against his mind, their voices murmuring at the edges of his thoughts. Whispers of lives erased, of kingdoms that no longer existed, of names that had been spoken once and never again. And then, from the depths of the ruins, a figure emerged. He was not like the others. His form did not flicker, nor did he fade like a shadow caught in shifting light. He was solid, real. And Kale knew without being told who he was. Azrakhan, the first sorcerer, the man who had written the spell that had doomed Kale's kingdom, the one who had unmade the world before. The sorcerer's gaze was sharp, ancient, filled with the knowing that sent a chill through Kale's bones. His robes were dark, stitched with symbols that twisted the longer Kale looked at them. The air around him pulsed with quiet power, as if even in this realm the remnants of his magic lingered. "You have come," Azrakhan said, his voice smooth, patient, as if he had been expecting this moment for eternity. "And now you seek to undo what has been done." Kale's throat tightened. "I need to stop the unmaking." Azrakhan watched him for a long moment, then exhaled softly. "Do you understand what you have done, child?" Kale's fists clenched. "I spoke the spell. I read the words. Azrakhan tilted his head slightly, studying him. And did you think words alone could break the world? His gaze darkened, something sharp behind his eyes. Magic does not simply happen. It requires something. A force, a will, a sacrifice. Do you know what you have sacrificed? Kale hesitated. The sorcerer lifted a hand, and suddenly Kale remembered. The palace. The night he had found the book. The words slipping from his lips, not just spoken, but called forth. Not as a mistake, not as an accident, but as something that had already been waiting inside him. The spell had not been dormant. It had been sleeping. And he had awakened it. His breath hitched. I didn't mean to... It does not matter what you meant, Azrakhan said, his voice quiet but unyielding. What is unmade does not return. Kale's heart pounded. There has to be a way. The oracle, she said I could undo this. Azrakhan's gaze remained steady. No. She said you could try. The sorcerer took a step forward. The ruins around them seemed to shift, as if the very world here bent to his presence. If you wish to halt the unmaking, you must give the world something in return. Kale swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming. A memory, a truth, or my name. Azrakhan nodded once. But it is not you who will choose. The air around them shivered. The ground beneath Kale's feet trembled. A force, vast and unseen, pressed down on him, pulling at the very core of his being. And then, he felt it. A tug. A loss. A piece of himself being taken. He gasped, staggering slightly. But when he lifted his head, Azrakhan was still watching him, waiting. Kale's breath came in quick, uneven bursts. What? What did it take? Azrakhan was silent for a long moment. Then softly he said, You will not remember. Kale's chest tightened. His thoughts felt hazy, as though something had slipped away. Something he should have held onto, but now was simply gone. Azrakhan stepped back, his form already beginning to fade. The world will mend in time, he said, but the cost is yours to bear. The ruins around them dissolved. The whispers of the forgotten ones faded into silence. And then Kale awoke. The wind was cold. The mountains were still. Dain was standing over him, shaking his shoulder. Kale, he said urgently, are you... Kale sat up, his head spinning. The rift was gone. The world was whole. And yet... He exhaled sharply, gripping his temples. Something was missing. Something important. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not remember. Dain watched him carefully. What happened? Kale hesitated. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. Because he did not know. All he knew was that the world was safe. The kingdom still stood. And somewhere deep within him, there was an emptiness that could never be filled, never be filled, never be filled, never be filled, never be filled.